Chapter 5. They finished supper, and while Mattie cleared the table, Ethan went to look at the cows and then took a last turn about the house. The earth lay dark under a muffled sky, and the air was so still that now and then he heard a lump of snow come thumping down from a tree far off on the edge of the woodlot. When he returned to the kitchen, Mattie had pushed up his chair to the stove and seated herself near the lamp with a bit of sewing. The scene was just as he had dreamed of it that morning. He sat down, drew his pipe from his pocket, and stretched his feet to the glow. His hard day's work in the keen air made him feel at once lazy and light of mood, and he had a confused sense of being in another world, where all was warmth and harmony, and time could bring no change. The only drawback to his complete well-being was the fact that he could not see Mattie from where he sat, but he was too indolent to move, and after a moment he said, "Come over here and sit by the stove." Zeena's empty rocking-chair stood facing him. Mattie rose obediently and seated herself in it. As her young brown head detached itself against the patchwork cushion that habitually framed his wife's gaunt countenance, Ethan had a momentary shock. It was almost as if the other face, the face of the superseded woman, had obliterated that of the intruder. After a moment Mattie seemed to be affected by the same sense of constraint. She changed her position, leaning forward to bend her head above her work, so that he saw only the foreshortened tip of her nose and the streak of red in her hair. Then she slipped to her feet, saying, "I can't see to sew," and went back to her chair by the lamp. Ethan made a pretext of getting up to replenish the stove, and when he returned to his seat he pushed it sideways that he might get a view of her profile and of the lamplight falling on her hands. The cat, who had been a puzzled observer of these unusual movements, jumped up into Zeena's chair, rolled itself into a ball, and lay watching them with narrowed eyes. Deep quiet sank on the room. The clock ticked above the dresser, a piece of charred wood fell now and then in the stove, and the faint sharp scent of the geraniums mingled with the odour of Ethan's smoke, which began to throw a blue haze about the lamp and to hang its greyish cobwebs in the shadowy corners of the room. All constraint had vanished between the two, and they began to talk easily and simply. They spoke of everyday things, of the prospect of snow, of the next church sociable, of the loves and quarrels of Starkfield. The commonplace nature of what they said produced in Ethan an illusion of long-established intimacy which no outburst of emotion could have given, and he set his imagination adrift on the fiction that they had always spent their evenings thus, and would always go on doing so. "This is the night we were to have gone coasting, Matt," he said at length, with the rich sense as he spoke that they could go on any other night they chose, since they had all the time before them. She smiled back at him. "I guess you forgot." "No, I didn't forget. But it's as dark as Egypt outdoors. We might go tomorrow if there's a moon." She laughed with pleasure, her head tilted back, the lamplight sparkling on her lips and teeth. "That would be lovely, Ethan." He kept his eyes fixed on her, marvelling at the way her face changed with each turn of their talk, like a wheat-field under a summer breeze. It was intoxicating to find such magic in his clumsy words, and he longed to try new ways of using it. "Would you be scared to go down the Corbury Road with me on a night like this?" he asked. Her cheeks burned redder. "I ain't any more scared than you are." "Well, I'd be scared then. I wouldn't do it. That's an ugly corner down by the big elm. If a fellow didn't keep his eyes open he'd go plumb into it." He luxuriated in the sense of protection and authority which his words conveyed. To prolong and intensify the feeling he added, "I guess we're well enough here." She let her lids sink slowly, in the way he loved. "Yes, we're well enough here," she sighed. Her tone was so sweet that he took the pipe from his mouth and drew his chair up to the table. Leaning forward, he touched the farther end of the strip of brown stuff that she was hemming. "Say, Matt," he began with a smile, "what do you think I saw under the Varnum spruces coming along home just now? I saw a friend of yours getting kissed." The words had been on his tongue all the evening, but now that he had spoken them, they struck him as inexpressibly vulgar and out of place. Mattie blushed to the roots of her hair and pulled her needle rapidly twice or thrice through her work, insensibly drawing the end of it away from him. "I suppose it was Ruth and Ned," she said in a low voice, as though he had suddenly touched on something grave. Ethan had imagined that his allusion might open the way to the accepted pleasantries, and these perhaps in turn to a harmless caress, if only a mere touch on her hand. But now he felt as if her blush had set a flaming guard about her. He supposed it was his natural awkwardness that made him feel so. He knew that most young men made nothing at all of giving a pretty girl a kiss, and he remembered that the night before, when he had put his arm about Mattie, she had not resisted. But that had been out of doors, under the open, irresponsible night. Now, in the warm, lamplit room, with all its ancient implications of conformity and order, she seemed infinitely farther away from him, and more unapproachable. To ease his constraint, he said, "I suppose they'll be setting a date before long." "Yes. I shouldn't wonder if they got married some time along in the summer." She pronounced the word married as if her voice caressed it. It seemed a rustling covert leading to enchanted glades. A pang shot through Ethan, and he said, twisting away from her in his chair, "It'll be your turn next, I wouldn't wonder." She laughed a little uncertainly. "Why do you keep on saying that?" He echoed her laugh. "I guess I do it to get used to the idea." He drew up to the table again, and she sewed on in silence, with dropped lashes, while he sat in fascinated contemplation of the way in which her hands went up and down above the strip of stuff, just as he had seen a pair of birds make short perpendicular flights over a nest they were building. At length, without turning her head or lifting her lids, she said in a low tone, "It's not because you think Zeena's got anything against me, is it?" His former dread started up full-armed at the suggestion. "Why? What do you mean?" he stammered. She raised distressed eyes to his, her work dropping on the table between them. "I don't know. I thought last night she seemed to have." "I'd like to know what," he growled. "Nobody can tell with Zeena." It was the first time they had ever spoken so openly of her attitude toward Mattie, and the repetition of the name seemed to carry it to the farthest corners of the room and send it back to them in long repercussions of sound. Mattie waited, as if to give the echo time to drop, and then went on. "She hasn't said anything to you?" He shook his head. "No, not a word." She tossed the hair back from her forehead with a laugh. "I guess I'm just nervous, then. I'm not going to think about it any more." "Oh, no. Don't let's think about it, Matt." The sudden heat of his tone made her colour mount again, not with a rush, but gradually, delicately, like the reflection of a thought stealing slowly across her heart. She sat silent, her hands clasped on her work, and it seemed to him that a warm current flowed toward him on the strip of stuff that still lay unrolled between them. Cautiously he slid his hand palm downward along the table, till his fingertips touched the end of the stuff. A faint vibration of her lashes seemed to show that she was aware of his gesture, and that it had sent a counter-current back to her, and she let her hands lie motionless on the other end of the strip. As they sat thus, he heard a sound behind him and turned his head. The cat had jumped from Zeena's chair to dart at a mouse in the wainscot, and as a result of the sudden movement the empty chair had set up a spectral rocking. "She'll be rocking in it herself this time tomorrow," Ethan thought. "I've been in a dream, and this is the only evening we'll ever have together." The return to reality was as painful as the return to consciousness after taking an anesthetic. His body and brain ached with indescribable weariness, and he could think of nothing to say or to do that should arrest the mad flight of the moments. His alteration of mood seemed to have communicated itself to Mattie. She looked up at him languidly, as though her lids were weighted with sleep, and it cost her an effort to raise them. Her glance fell on his hand, which now completely covered the end of her work, and grasped it as if it were a part of herself. He saw a scarcely perceptible tremor cross her face, and without knowing what he did, he stooped his head and kissed the bit of stuff in his hold. As his lips rested on it, he felt it glide slowly from beneath them, and saw that Mattie had risen and was silently rolling up her work. She fastened it with a pin, and then, finding her thimble and scissors, put them with the roll of stuff into the box covered with fancy paper which he had once brought to her from Bettsbridge. He stood up also, looking vaguely about the room. The clock above the dresser struck 11. "Is the fire all right?" she asked in a low voice. He opened the door of the stove and poked aimlessly at the embers. When he raised himself again, he saw that she was dragging toward the stove the old soap-box lined with carpet in which the cat made its bed. Then she recrossed the floor and lifted 2 of the geranium pots in her arms, moving them away from the cold window. He followed her and brought the other geraniums, the hyacinth bulbs in a cracked custard bowl, and the German ivy trailed over an old croquet hoop. When these nightly duties were performed, there was nothing left to do but to bring in the tin candlestick from the passage, light the candle, and blow out the lamp. Ethan put the candlestick in Mattie's hand, and she went out of the kitchen ahead of him, the light that she carried before her making her dark hair look like a drift of mist on the moon. "Good night, Matt," he said, as she put her foot on the first step of the stairs. She turned and looked at him a moment. "Good night, Ethan," she answered, and went up. When the door of her room had closed on her, he remembered that he had not even touched her hand. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. The next morning at breakfast Jotham Powell was between them, and Ethan tried to hide his joy under an air of exaggerated indifference, lounging back in his chair to throw scraps to the cat, growling at the weather, and not so much as offering to help Mattie when she rose to clear away the dishes. He did not know why he was so irrationally happy, for nothing was changed in his life or hers. He had not even touched the tip of her fingers, or looked her full in the eyes. But their evening together had given him a vision of what life at her side might be, and he was glad now that he had done nothing to trouble the sweetness of the picture. He had a fancy that she knew what had restrained him. There was a last load of lumber to be hauled to the village, and Jotham Powell, who did not work regularly for Ethan in winter, had come round to help with the job. But a wet snow, melting to sleet, had fallen in the night and turned the roads to glass. There was more wet in the air, and it seemed likely to both men that the weather would milden toward afternoon and make the going safer. Ethan therefore proposed to his assistant that they should load the sledge at the woodlot, as they had done on the previous morning, and put off the teaming to Starkfield till later in the day. This plan had the advantage of enabling him to send Jotham to the flats after dinner to meet Zenobia, while he himself took the lumber down to the village. He told Jotham to go out and harness up the greys, and for a moment he and Mattie had the kitchen to themselves. She had plunged the breakfast dishes into a tin dishpan, and was bending above it with her slim arms bare to the elbow, the steam from the hot water beating her forehead and tightening her rough hair into little brown rings, like the tendrils on the traveller's joy. Ethan stood looking at her, his heart in his throat. He wanted to say, "We shall never be alone again like this." Instead, he reached down his tobacco pouch from a shelf of the dresser, put it into his pocket, and said, "I guess I can make out to be home for dinner." She answered, "All right, Ethan," and he heard her singing over the dishes as he went. As soon as the sledge was loaded he meant to send Jotham back to the farm and hurry on foot into the village to buy the glue for the pickle dish. With ordinary luck he should have had time to carry out this plan, but everything went wrong from the start. On the way over to the woodlot one of the greys slipped on a glare of ice and cut his knee, and when they got him up again Jotham had to go back to the barn for a strip of rag to bind the cut. Then, when the loading finally began, a sleety rain was coming down once more, and the tree trunks were so slippery that it took twice as long as usual to lift them and get them in place on the sledge. It was what Jotham called a sour morning for work, and the horses, shivering and stamping under their wet blankets, seemed to like it as little as the men. It was long past the dinner hour when the job was done, and Ethan had to give up going to the village because he wanted to lead the injured horse home and wash the cut himself. He thought that by starting out again with the lumber as soon as he had finished his dinner he might get back to the farm with the glue before Jotham and the old sorrel had had time to fetch Zenobia from the flats. But he knew the chance was a slight one. It turned on the state of the roads and on the possible lateness of the Bettsbridge train. He remembered afterward, with a grim flash of self-derision, what importance he had attached to the weighing of these probabilities. As soon as dinner was over he set out again for the woodlot, not daring to linger till Jotham Powell left. The hired man was still drying his wet feet at the stove, and Ethan could only give Mattie a quick look as he said beneath his breath, "I'll be back early." He fancied that she nodded her comprehension, and with that scant solace he had to trudge off through the rain. He had driven his load halfway to the village when Jotham Powell overtook him, urging the reluctant sorrel toward the flats. "I'll have to hurry up to do it," Ethan mused, as the sleigh dropped down ahead of him over the dip of the schoolhouse hill. He worked like 10 at the unloading, and when it was over hastened on to Michael Eady's for the glue. Eady and his assistant were both down street, and young Denis, who seldom deigned to take their place, was lounging by the stove with a knot of the golden youth of Starkfield. They hailed Ethan with ironic compliment and offers of conviviality, but no one knew where to find the glue. Ethan, consumed with the longing for a last moment alone with Mattie, hung about impatiently while Denis made an ineffectual search in the obscurer corners of the store. "Looks as if we were all sold out, but if you'll wait around till the old man comes along maybe he could put his hand on it." "I'm obliged to you, but I'll try if I can get it down at Mrs. Homan's," Ethan answered, burning to be gone. Denis's commercial instinct compelled him to aver an oath that what Edie's store could not produce would never be found at the widow Homan's, but Ethan, heedless of this boast, had already climbed to the sledge and was driving on to the rival establishment. Here, after considerable search and sympathetic questions as to what he wanted it for, and whether ordinary flour paste wouldn't do as well if she couldn't find it, the widow Homan finally hunted down her solitary bottle of glue to its hiding-place in a medley of cough lozenges and corset laces. "I hope Zena ain't broken anything she sets store by," she called after him as he turned the greys toward home. The fitful bursts of sleet had changed into a steady rain, and the horses had heavy work even without a load behind them. Once or twice, hearing sleigh bells, Ethan turned his head, fancying that Zena and Jotham might overtake him. But the old sorrel was not in sight, and he set his face against the rain and urged on his ponderous pair. The barn was empty when the horses turned into it, and after giving them the most perfunctory ministrations they had ever received from him, he strode up to the house and pushed open the kitchen door. Mattie was there alone, as he had pictured her. She was bending over a pan on the stove, but at the sound of his step she turned with a start and sprang to him. "See here, Matt, I've got some stuff to mend the dish with. Let me get at it quick," he cried, waving the bottle in one hand while he put her lightly aside, but she did not seem to hear him. "Oh, Ethan, Zena's come," she said in a whisper, clutching his sleeve. They stood and stared at each other, pale as culprits. "But the sorrel's not in the barn," Ethan stammered. "Jotham Powell brought some goods over from the flats for his wife, and he drove right on home with them," she explained. He gazed blankly about the kitchen, which looked cold and squalid in the rainy winter twilight. "How is she?" he asked, dropping his voice to Mattie's whisper. She looked away from him uncertainly. "I don't know. She went right up to her room." "She didn't say anything?" "No." Ethan let out his doubts in a low whistle and thrust the bottle back into his pocket. "Don't fret. I'll come down and mend it in the night," he said. He pulled on his wet coat again and went back to the barn to feed the greys. While he was there, Jotham Powell drove up with the sleigh, and when the horses had been attended to, Ethan said to him, "You might as well come back up for a bite." He was not sorry to assure himself of Jotham's neutralizing presence at the supper table, for Zena was always nervous after a journey. But the hired man, though seldom loath to accept a meal not included in his wages, opened his stiff jaws to answer slowly, "I'm obliged to you, but I guess I'll go along back." Ethan looked at him in surprise. "Better come up and dry off. Looks as if there'd be something hot for supper." Jotham's facial muscles were unmoved by this appeal, and, his vocabulary being limited, he merely repeated, "I guess I'll go along back." To Ethan there was something vaguely ominous in this stolid rejection of free food and warmth, and he wondered what had happened on the drive to nerve Jotham to such stoicism. Perhaps Zena had failed to see the new doctor, or had not liked his counsels. Ethan knew that in such cases the first person she met was likely to be held responsible for her grievance. When he re-entered the kitchen the lamp lit up the same scene of shining comfort as on the previous evening. The table had been as carefully laid, a clear fire glowed in the stove, the cat dozed in its warmth, and Mattie came forward carrying a plate of doughnuts. She and Ethan looked at each other in silence. Then she said, as she had said the night before, "I guess it's about time for supper." End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7. Ethan went out into the passage to hang up his wet garments. He listened for Zena's step, and not hearing it, called her name up the stairs. She did not answer, and after a moment's hesitation he went up and opened her door. The room was almost dark, but in the obscurity he saw her sitting by the window, bolt upright, and knew by the rigidity of the outline projected against the pane that she had not taken off her travelling dress. "Well, Zena," he ventured from the threshold. She did not move, and he continued, "Supper's about ready. Ain't you coming?" She replied, "I don't feel as if I could touch a morsel." It was the consecrated formula, and he expected it to be followed, as usual, by her rising and going down to supper. But she remained seated, and he could think of nothing more felicitous than, "I presume you're tired after the long ride." Turning her head at this, she answered solemnly, "I'm a great deal sicker than you think." Her words fell on his ear with a strange shock of wonder. He had often heard her pronounce them before. What if at last they were true? He advanced a step or two into the dim room. "I hope that's not so, Zena," he said. She continued to gaze at him through the twilight with a mien of wan authority, as of one consciously singled out for a great fate. "I've got complications," she said. Ethan knew the word for one of exceptional import. Almost everybody in the neighbourhood had troubles, frankly localized and specified, but only the chosen had complications. To have them was in itself a distinction, though it was also, in most cases, a death warrant. People struggled on for years with troubles, but they almost always succumbed to complications. Ethan's heart was jerking to and fro between two extremities of feeling, but for the moment compassion prevailed. His wife looked so hard and lonely, sitting there in the darkness with such thoughts. "Is that what the new doctor told you?" he asked, instinctively lowering his voice. "Yes. He says any regular doctor would want me to have an operation." Ethan was aware that, in regard to the important question of surgical intervention, the female opinion of the neighbourhood was divided, some glorying in the prestige conferred by operations, while others shunned them as indelicate. Ethan, from motives of economy, had always been glad that Zena was of the latter faction. In the agitation caused by the gravity of her announcement, he sought a consolatory shortcut. "What do you know about this doctor, anyway? Nobody ever told you that before." He saw his blunder before she could take it up. She wanted sympathy, not consolation. "I didn't need to have anybody tell me I was losing ground every day. Everybody but you could see it. And everybody in Bettsbridge knows about Dr. Buck. He has his office in Worcester, and comes over once a fortnight to Shadd's Falls and Bettsbridge for consultations. Eliza Spears was wasting away with kidney trouble before she went to him, and now she's up and around, and singing in the choir." "Well, I'm glad of that. You must do just what he tells you," Ethan answered sympathetically. She was still looking at him. "I mean to," she said. He was struck by a new note in her voice. It was neither whining nor reproachful, but dryly resolute. "What does he want you should do?" he asked, with a mounting vision of fresh expenses. "He wants I should have a hired girl. He says I oughtn't to have to do a single thing around the house." "A hired girl?" Ethan stood transfixed. "Yes, and Aunt Martha found me one right off. Everybody said I was lucky to get a girl to come away out here, and I agreed to give her $1 extra to make sure. She'll be over tomorrow afternoon." Wrath and dismay contended in Ethan. He had foreseen an immediate demand for money, but not a permanent drain on his scant resources. He no longer believed what Zena had told him of the supposed seriousness of her state. He saw in her expedition to Bettsbridge only a plot hatched between herself and her Pierce relations to foist on him the cost of a servant, and for the moment wrath predominated. "If you meant to engage a girl, you ought to have told me before you started," he said. "How could I tell you before I started? How did I know what Dr. Buck would say?" "Oh, Dr. Buck!" Ethan's incredulity escaped in a short laugh. "Did Dr. Buck tell you how I was to pay her wages?" Her voice rose furiously with his. "No, he didn't, for I'd have been ashamed to tell him that you grudged me the money to get back my health, when I lost it nursing your own mother." "You lost your health nursing mother?" "Yes, and my folks all told me at the time you couldn't do no less than marry me after." "Zena!" Through the obscurity which hid their faces their thoughts seemed to dart at each other like serpents shooting venom. Ethan was seized with horror of the scene and shame at his own share in it. It was as senseless and savage as a physical fight between two enemies in the darkness. He turned to the shelf above the chimney, groped for matches and lit the one candle in the room. At first its weak flame made no impression on the shadows. Then Zeena's face stood grimly out against the uncurtained pane, which had turned from grey to black. It was the first scene of open anger between the couple in their sad 7 years together, and Ethan felt as if he had lost an irretrievable advantage in descending to the level of recrimination. But the practical problem was there, and had to be dealt with. "You know I haven't got the money to pay for a girl, Zeena. You'll have to send her back. I can't do it." "The doctor says it'll be my death if I go on slaving the way I've had to. He doesn't understand how I've stood it as long as I have." "Slaving!" He checked himself again. "You shan't lift a hand if he says so. I'll do everything round the house myself." She broke in. "You're neglecting the farm enough already." And this being true, he found no answer, and left her time to add ironically, "Better send me over to the almshouse and done with it. I guess there's been Fromes there afore now." The taunt burned into him, but he let it pass. "I haven't got the money. That settles it." There was a moment's pause in the struggle, as though the combatants were testing their weapons. Then Zeena said in a level voice, "I thought you were to get $50 from Andrew Hale for that lumber." "Andrew Hale never pays under 3 months." He had hardly spoken when he remembered the excuse he had made for not accompanying his wife to the station the day before, and the blood rose to his frowning brows. "Why, you told me yesterday you'd fixed it up with him to pay cash down. You said that was why you couldn't drive me over to the Flats." Ethan had no suppleness in deceiving. He had never before been convicted of a lie, and all the resources of evasion failed him. "I guess that was a misunderstanding," he stammered. "You ain't got the money?" "No." "And you ain't going to get it?" "No." "Well, I couldn't know that when I engaged the girl, could I?" "No." He paused to control his voice. "But you know it now. I'm sorry, but it can't be helped. You're a poor man's wife, Zeena, but I'll do the best I can for you." For a while she sat motionless, as if reflecting, her arms stretched along the arms of her chair, her eyes fixed on vacancy. "Oh, I guess we'll make out," she said mildly. The change in her tone reassured him. "Of course we will. There's a whole lot more I can do for you. And Mattie—" Zeena, while he spoke, seemed to be following out some elaborate mental calculation. She emerged from it to say, "There'll be Mattie's board less, anyhow." Ethan, supposing the discussion to be over, had turned to go down to supper. He stopped short, not grasping what he heard. "Mattie's board less," he began. Zeena laughed. It was an odd, unfamiliar sound. He did not remember ever having heard her laugh before. "You didn't suppose I was going to keep 2 girls, did you? No wonder you were scared at the expense." He still had but a confused sense of what she was saying. From the beginning of the discussion he had instinctively avoided the mention of Mattie's name, fearing he hardly knew what, criticism, complaints, or vague allusions to the imminent probability of her marrying. But the thought of a definite rupture had never come to him, and even now could not lodge itself in his mind. "I don't know what you mean," he said. "Mattie Silver's not a hired girl. She's your relation." "She's a pauper that's hung on to us all after her father'd done his best to ruin us. I've kep' her here for a whole year. It's somebody else's turn now." As the shrill words shot out, Ethan heard a tap on the door, which he had drawn shut when he turned back from the threshold. "Ethan! Zeena!" Mattie's voice sounded gaily from the landing. "Do you know what time it is? Supper's been ready half an hour." Inside the room there was a moment's silence. Then Zeena called out from her seat, "I'm not coming down to supper." "Oh, I'm sorry. Aren't you well? Shan't I bring you up a bite of something?" Ethan roused himself with an effort and opened the door. "Go along down, Matt. Zeena's just a little tired. I'm coming." He heard her "All right," and her quick step on the stairs. Then he shut the door and turned back into the room. His wife's attitude was unchanged, her face inexorable, and he was seized with the despairing sense of his helplessness. "You ain't going to do it, Zeena." "Do what?" she emitted between flattened lips. "Send Mattie away, like this." "I never bargained to take her for life." He continued with rising vehemence. "You can't put her out of the house like a thief, a poor girl without friends or money. She's done her best for you, and she's got no place to go to. You may forget she's your kin, but everybody else'll remember it. If you do a thing like that, what do you suppose folks'll say of you?" Zeena waited a moment, as if giving him time to feel the full force of the contrast between his own excitement and her composure. Then she replied in the same smooth voice: "I know well enough what they say of my having kep' her here as long as I have." Ethan's hand dropped from the doorknob, which he had held clenched since he had drawn the door shut on Mattie. His wife's retort was like a knife cut across the sinews, and he suddenly felt weak and powerless. He had meant to humble himself, to argue that Mattie's keep didn't cost much, after all, that he could make out to buy a stove and fix up a place in the attic for the hired girl, but Zeena's words revealed the peril of such pleadings. "You mean to tell her she's got to go, at once?" he faltered out, in terror of letting his wife complete her sentence. As if trying to make him see reason, she replied impartially: "The girl will be over from Bettsbridge tomorrow, and I presume she's got to have somewheres to sleep." Ethan looked at her with loathing. She was no longer the listless creature who had lived at his side in a state of sullen self-absorption, but a mysterious alien presence, an evil energy secreted from the long years of silent brooding. It was the sense of his helplessness that sharpened his antipathy. There had never been anything in her that one could appeal to, but as long as he could ignore and command he had remained indifferent. Now she had mastered him, and he abhorred her. Mattie was her relation, not his. There were no means by which he could compel her to keep the girl under her roof. All the long misery of his baffled past, of his youth of failure, hardship, and vain effort, rose up in his soul in bitterness and seemed to take shape before him in the woman who at every turn had barred his way. She had taken everything else from him, and now she meant to take the one thing that made up for all the others. For a moment such a flame of hate rose in him that it ran down his arm and clenched his fist against her. He took a wild step forward, and then stopped. You're not coming down?" he asked in a bewildered voice. "No. I guess I'll lay down on the bed a little while," she answered mildly, and he turned and walked out of the room. In the kitchen, Mattie was sitting by the stove, the cat curled up on her knees. She sprang to her feet as Ethan entered and carried the covered dish of meat pie to the table. "I hope Zeena isn't sick?" she asked. "No." She shone at him across the table. "Well, sit right down then. You must be starving." She uncovered the pie and pushed it over to him. So they were to have one more evening together, her happy eyes seemed to say. He helped himself mechanically and began to eat. Then disgust took him by the throat, and he laid down his fork. Mattie's tender gaze was on him, and she marked the gesture. "Why, Ethan, what's the matter? Don't it taste right?" "Yes, it's first rate, only He pushed his plate away, rose from his chair, and walked around the table to her side. She started up with frightened eyes. "Ethan, there's something wrong. I knew there was." She seemed to melt against him in her terror, and he caught her in his arms, held her fast there, felt her lashes beat his cheek like netted butterflies. "What is it? What is it?" she stammered. But he had found her lips at last, and was drinking unconsciousness of everything but the joy they gave him. She lingered a moment, caught in the same strong current, then she slipped from him and drew back a step or two, pale and troubled. Her look smote him with compunction, and he cried out, as if he saw her drowning in a dream, "You can't go, Matt! I'll never let you!" "Go? Go?" she stammered. "Must I go?" The words went on sounding between them as though a torch of warning flew from hand to hand through a black landscape. Ethan was overcome with shame at his lack of self-control in flinging the news at her so brutally. His head reeled, and he had to support himself against the table. All the while he felt as if he were still kissing her, and yet dying of thirst for her lips. "Ethan, what has happened? Is Zeena mad with me?" Her cry steadied him, though it deepened his wrath and pity. "No, no," he assured her. "It's not that. But this new doctor has scared her about herself. You know she believes all they say the first time she sees them. And this one's told her she won't get well unless she lays up and don't do a thing about the house, not for months." He paused, his eyes wandering from her miserably. She stood silent a moment, drooping before him like a broken branch. She was so small and weak-looking that it wrung his heart, but suddenly she lifted her head and looked straight at him. "And she wants someone handier in my place? Is that it?" "That's what she says tonight." "If she says it tonight, she'll say it tomorrow." Both bowed to the inexorable truth. They knew that Zeena never changed her mind, and that in her case a resolve once taken was equivalent to an act performed. There was a long silence between them. Then Mattie said in a low voice, "Don't be too sorry, Ethan." "Oh, God, oh, God!" he groaned. The glow of passion he had felt for her had melted to an aching tenderness. He saw her quick lids beating back the tears, and longed to take her in his arms and soothe her. "You're letting your supper get cold," she admonished him with a pale gleam of gaiety. "Oh, Matt, Matt, where'll you go to?" Her lids sank and a tremor crossed her face. He saw that for the first time the thought of the future came to her distinctly. "I might get something to do over at Stamford," she faltered, as if knowing that he knew she had no hope. He dropped back into his seat and hid his face in his hands. Despair seized him at the thought of her setting out alone to renew the weary quest for work. In the only place where she was known, she was surrounded by indifference or animosity. And what chance had she, inexperienced and untrained, among the million bread-seekers of the cities? There came back to him miserable tales he had heard at Worcester, and the faces of girls whose lives had begun as hopefully as Mattie's. It was not possible to think of such things without a revolt of his whole being. He sprang up suddenly. "You can't go, Matt. I won't let you. She's always had her way, but I mean to have mine now." Mattie lifted her hand with a quick gesture, and he heard his wife's step behind him. Zeena came into the room with her dragging down at the heel step, and quietly took her accustomed seat between them. "I feel a little mite better, and Dr. Buck says I ought to eat all I can to keep my strength up, even if I ain't got any appetite," she said in her flat whine, reaching across Mattie for the teapot. Her good dress had been replaced by the black calico and brown knitted shawl which formed her daily wear, and with them she had put on her usual face and manner. She poured out her tea, added a great deal of milk to it, helped herself largely to pie and pickles, and made the familiar gesture of adjusting her false teeth before she began to eat. The cat rubbed itself ingratiatingly against her, and she said, "Good pussy," stooped to stroke it, and gave it a scrap of meat from her plate. Ethan sat speechless, not pretending to eat, but Mattie nibbled valiantly at her food and asked Zeena one or two questions about her visit to Bettsbridge. Zeena answered in her everyday tone, and, warming to the theme, regaled them with several vivid descriptions of intestinal disturbances among her friends and relatives. She looked straight at Mattie as she spoke, a faint smile deepening the vertical lines between her nose and chin. When supper was over she rose from her seat and pressed her hand to the flat surface over the region of her heart. "That pie of yours always sets a mite heavy, Matt," she said, not ill-naturedly. She seldomly abbreviated the girl's name, and when she did so it was always a sign of affability. "I've a good mind to go and hunt up those stomach powders I got last year over in Springfield," she continued. "I ain't tried them for quite a while, and maybe they'll help the heartburn." Mattie lifted her eyes. "Can't I get them for you, Zeena?" she ventured. "No, they're in a place you don't know about," Zeena answered darkly, with one of her secret looks. She went out of the kitchen, and Mattie, rising, began to clear the dishes from the table. As she passed Ethan's chair their eyes met and clung together desolately. The warm, still kitchen looked as peaceful as the night before. The cat had sprung to Zeena's rocking-chair, and the heat of the fire was beginning to draw out the faint, sharp scent of the geraniums. Ethan dragged himself wearily to his feet. "I'll go out and take a look around," he said, going toward the passage to get his lantern. As he reached the door he met Zeena coming back into the room, her lips twitching with anger, a flush of excitement on her sallow face. The shawl had slipped from her shoulders and was dragging at her downtrodden heels, and in her hand she carried the fragment of the red glass pickle dish. "I'd like to know who has done this," she said, looking sternly from Ethan to Mattie. There was no answer, and she continued in a trembling voice. "I went to get those powders I'd put away in father's old spectacle case, top of the china closet, where I keep the things I set store by, so's folks shan't meddle with them." Her voice broke, and 2 small tears hung on her lashless lids and ran slowly down her cheeks. "It takes the step-ladder to get at the top shelf, and I put Aunt Philura Maple's pickle dish up there a purpose when we was married, and it's never been down since, 'cept for the spring cleaning, and then I always lifted it with my own hands so's it shouldn't get broke." She laid the fragments reverently on the table. "I want to know who done this," she quavered. At the challenge Ethan turned back into the room and faced her. "I can tell you, then. The cat done it." "The cat?" "That's what I said." She looked at him hard, and then turned her eyes to Mattie, who was carrying the dishpan to the table. "I'd like to know how the cat got into my china closet," she said. "Chasing mice, I guess," Ethan rejoined. "There was a mouse round the kitchen all last evening." Zeena continued to look from one to the other. Then she emitted her small, strange laugh. "I knew the cat was a smart cat," she said in a high voice, "but I didn't know he was smart enough to pick up the pieces of my pickle dish and lay 'em edge to edge on the very shelf he knocked 'em off of." Mattie suddenly drew her arms out of the steaming water. "It wasn't Ethan's fault, Zeena. The cat did break the dish, but I got it down from the china closet, and I'm the one to blame for its getting broken." Zeena stood beside the ruin of her treasure, stiffening into a stony image of resentment. "You got down my pickle dish. What for?" A bright flush flew to Mattie's cheeks. "I wanted to make the supper table pretty," she said. "You wanted to make the supper table pretty, and you waited till my back was turned, and took the thing I set most store by of anything I've got, and wouldn't never use it, not even when the minister come to dinner, or Aunt Martha Pierce come over from Bettsbridge." Zeena paused with a gasp, as if terrified by her own evocation of the sacrilege. "You're a bad girl, Mattie Silver, and I always known it. It's the way your father begun, and I was warned of it when I took you, and I tried to keep my things where you couldn't get at 'em. And now you've took from me the one I cared for most of all." She broke off in a short spasm of sobs that passed and left her more than ever like a shape of stone. "If I'd 'a' listened to folks, you'd 'a' gone before now, and this wouldn't 'a' happened," she said. And gathering up the bits of broken glass, she went out of the room as if she carried a dead body. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. When Ethan was called back to the farm by his father's illness, his mother gave him, for his own use, a small room behind the untenanted best parlour. Here he had nailed up shelves for his books, built himself a box sofa out of boards and a mattress, laid out his papers on a kitchen table, hung on the rough plaster wall an engraving of Abraham Lincoln, and a calendar with "Thoughts from the Poets," and tried with these meagre properties to produce some likeness to the study of a minister who had been kind to him and lent him books when he was at Worcester. He still took refuge there in summer, but when Mattie came to live at the farm he had to give her his stove, and consequently the room was uninhabitable for several months of the year. To this retreat he descended as soon as the house was quiet, and Zeena's steady breathing from the bed had assured him that there was to be no sequel to the scene in the kitchen. After Zeena's departure he and Mattie had stood speechless, neither seeking to approach the other. Then the girl had returned to her task of clearing up the kitchen for the night, and he had taken his lantern and gone on his usual round outside the house. The kitchen was empty when he came back to it, but his tobacco pouch and pipe had been laid on the table, and under them was a scrap of paper torn from the back of a seedsman catalogue, on which 3 words were written: "Don't trouble, Ethan." Going into his cold, dark study, he placed the lantern on the table, and, stooping to its light, read the message again and again. It was the first time that Mattie had ever written to him, and the possession of the paper gave him a strange new sense of her nearness, yet it deepened his anguish by reminding him that henceforth they would have no other way of communicating with each other. For the life of her smile, the warmth of her voice, only cold paper and dead words. Confused motions of rebellion stormed in him. He was too young, too strong, too full of the sap of living, to submit so easily to the destruction of his hopes. Must he wear out all his years at the side of a bitter, querulous woman? Other possibilities had been in him, possibilities sacrificed, one by one, to Zeena's narrow-mindedness and ignorance. And what good had come of it? She was 100 times bitterer and more discontented than when he had married her. The one pleasure left her was to inflict pain on him. All the healthy instincts of self-defense rose up in him against such waste. He bundled himself into his old coonskin coat and lay down on the box sofa to think. Under his cheek he felt a hard object with strange protuberances. It was a cushion which Zeena had made for him when they were engaged, the only piece of needlework he had ever seen her do. He flung it across the floor and propped his head against the wall. He knew a case of a man over the mountain, a young fellow of about his own age, who had escaped from just such a life of misery by going west with the girl he cared for. His wife had divorced him, and he had married the girl and prospered. Ethan had seen the couple the summer before at Shadd's Falls, when they had come to visit relatives. They had a little girl with fair curls, who wore a gold locket and was dressed like a princess. The deserted wife had not done badly either. Her husband had given her the farm, and she had managed to sell it, and with that and the alimony she had started a lunchroom at Bettsbridge, and bloomed into activity and importance. Ethan was fired by the thought. Why should he not leave with Mattie the next day, instead of letting her go alone? He would hide his valise under the seat of the sleigh, and Zeena would suspect nothing till she went upstairs for her afternoon nap and found a letter on the bed. His impulses were still near the surface, and he sprang up, relit the lantern, and sat down at the table. He rummaged in the drawer for a sheet of paper, found one, and began to write. Zeena, I've done all I could for you, and I don't see as it's been of any use. I don't blame you, nor I don't blame myself. Maybe both of us will do better separate. I'm going to try my luck west, and you can sell the farm and mill, and keep the money. His pen paused on the word, which brought home to him the relentless conditions of his lot. If he gave the farm and mill to Zeena, what would be left him to start his own life with? Once in the West he was sure of picking up work. He would not have feared to try his chance alone. But with Mattie depending on him, the case was different. And what of Zeena's fate? Farm and mill were mortgaged to the limit of their value, and even if she found a purchaser, in itself an unlikely chance, it was doubtful if she could clear $1,000 on the sale. Meanwhile, how could she keep the farm going? It was only by incessant labor and personal supervision that Ethan drew a meagre living from his land, and his wife, even if she were in better health than she imagined, could never carry such a burden alone. Well, she could go back to her people, then, and see what they would do for her. It was the fate she was forcing on Mattie. Why not let her try it herself? By the time she had discovered his whereabouts and brought suit for divorce, he would probably, wherever he was, be earning enough to pay her a sufficient alimony. And the alternative was to let Mattie go forth alone, with far less hope of ultimate provision. He had scattered the contents of the table drawer in his search for a sheet of paper, and as he took up his pen his eyes fell on an old copy of the Bettsbridge Eagle. The advertising sheet was folded uppermost, and he read the seductive words, "Trips to the West, reduced rates." He drew the lantern nearer and eagerly scanned the fares. Then the paper fell from his hand, and he pushed aside his unfinished letter. A moment ago he had wondered what he and Mattie were to live on when they reached the West. Now he saw that he had not even the money to take her there. Borrowing was out of the question. 6 months before he had given his only security to raise funds for necessary repairs to the mill, and he knew that without security no one at Starkfield would lend him $10. The inexorable facts closed in on him like prison warders handcuffing a convict. There was no way out, none. He was a prisoner for life, and now his one ray of light was to be extinguished. He crept back heavily to the sofa, stretching himself out with limbs so leaden that he felt as if they would never move again. Tears rose in his throat and slowly burned their way to his lids. As he lay there, the window pane that faced him, growing gradually lighter, inlaid upon the darkness a square of moon-suffused sky. A crooked tree branch crossed it, a branch of the apple tree under which, on summer evenings, he had sometimes found Mattie sitting when he came up from the mill. Slowly the rim of the rainy vapours caught fire and burned away, and a pure moon swung into the blue. Ethan, rising on his elbow, watched the landscape whiten and shape itself under the sculpture of the moon. This was the night on which he was to have taken Mattie coasting, and there hung the lamp to light them. He looked out at the slopes bathed in lustre, the silver-edged darkness of the woods, the spectral purple of the hills against the sky, and it seemed as though all the beauty of the night had been poured out to mock his wretchedness. He fell asleep, and when he woke the chill of the winter dawn was in the room. He felt cold and stiff and hungry, and ashamed of being hungry. He rubbed his eyes and went to the window. A red sun stood over the grey rim of the fields, behind trees that looked black and brittle. He said to himself, "This is Matt's last day," and tried to think what the place would be without her. As he stood there he heard a step behind him, and she entered. "Oh, Ethan, were you here all night?" She looked so small and pinched, in her poor dress, with the red scarf wound about her, and the cold light turning her paleness sallow, that Ethan stood before her without speaking. "You must be frozen," she went on, fixing lustreless eyes on him. He drew a step nearer. "How did you know I was here?" "Because I heard you go downstairs again after I went to bed, and I listened all night, and you didn't come up." All his tenderness rushed to his lips. He looked at her and said, "I'll come right along and make up the kitchen fire." They went back to the kitchen, and he fetched the coal and kindlings and cleared out the stove for her, while she brought in the milk and the cold remains of the meat pie. When warmth began to radiate from the stove, and the first ray of sunlight lay on the kitchen floor, Ethan's dark thoughts melted in the mellower air. The sight of Mattie going about her work as he had seen her on so many mornings made it seem impossible that she should ever cease to be a part of the scene. He said to himself that he had doubtless exaggerated the significance of Zeena's threats, and that she, too, with the return of daylight, would come to a saner mood. He went up to Mattie as she bent above the stove, and laid his hand on her arm. "I don't want you should trouble either," he said, looking down at her eyes with a smile. She flushed up warmly and whispered back, "No, Ethan, I ain't gonna trouble." "I guess things'll straighten out," he added. There was no answer but a quick throb of her lids, and he went on, "She ain't said anything this morning?" "No, I haven't seen her yet." "Don't you take any notice when you do." With this injunction he left her and went out to the cow-barn. He saw Jotham Powell walking up the hill through the morning mist, and the familiar sight added to his growing conviction of security. As the two men were clearing out the stalls, Jotham rested on his pitchfork to say, "Dan'l Byrne's going over to the Flats today noon, and he could take Mattie's trunk along, and make it easier ridin' when I take her over in the sleigh." Ethan looked at him blankly, and he continued, "Miss Frome said the new girl'd be at the Flats at 5, and I was to take Mattie then, so's she could catch the 6 o'clock train for Stamford." Ethan felt the blood drumming in his temples. He had to wait a moment before he could find voice to say, "Oh, it ain't so sure about Mattie's going." "That's so," said Jotham indifferently, and they went on with their work. When they returned to the kitchen the two women were already at breakfast. Zeena had an air of unusual alertness and activity. She drank 2 cups of coffee and fed the cat with the scraps left in the pie dish. Then she rose from her seat, and walking over to the window snipped 2 or 3 yellow leaves from the geraniums. "Aunt Martha's ain't got a faded leaf on 'em, but they pine away when they ain't cared for," she said reflectively. Then she turned to Jotham and asked, "What time do you say Dan'l Byrne be along?" The hired man threw a hesitating glance at Ethan. "Round about noon," he said. Zeena turned to Mattie. "That trunk of yours is too heavy for the sleigh, and Dan'l Byrne'll be round to take it over to the Flats," she said. "I'm much obliged to you, Zeena," said Mattie. "I'd like to go over things with you first," Zeena continued in an unperturbed voice. "I know there's a huckabuck towel missing, and I can't take out what you done with that match safe used to stand behind the stuffed owl in the parlour." She went out, followed by Mattie, and when the men were alone Jotham said to his employer, "I guess I better let Dan'l come around, then." Ethan finished his usual morning tasks about the house and barn. Then he said to Jotham, "I'm going down to Starkfield. Tell them not to wait dinner." The passion of rebellion had broken out in him again. That which had seemed incredible in the sober light of day had really come to pass, and he was to assist as a helpless spectator at Mattie's banishment. His manhood was humbled by the part he was compelled to play, and by the thought of what Mattie must think of him. Confused impulses struggled in him as he strode along to the village. He had made up his mind to do something, but he did not know what it would be. The early mist had vanished and the fields lay like a silver shield under the sun. It was one of the days when the glitter of winter shines through a pale haze of spring. Every yard of the road was alive with Mattie's presence, and there was hardly a branch against the sky or a tangle of brambles on the bank in which some bright shred of memory was not caught. Once, in the stillness, the call of a bird in the mountain ash was so like her laughter that his heart tightened and then grew large, and all these things made him see that something must be done at once. Suddenly it occurred to him that Andrew Hale, who was a kind-hearted man, might be induced to reconsider his refusal and advance a small sum on the lumber if he were told that Zeena's ill health made it necessary to hire a servant. Hale, after all, knew enough of Ethan's situation to make it possible for the latter to renew his appeal without too much loss of pride, and moreover, how much did pride count in the ebullition of passions in his breast? The more he considered his plan, the more hopeful it seemed. If he could get Mrs. Hale's ear, he felt certain of success, and with $50 in his pocket, nothing could keep him from Mattie. His first object was to reach Starkfield before Hale had started for his work. He knew the carpenter had a job down the Corbury road and was likely to leave his house early. Ethan's long strides grew more rapid with the accelerated beat of his thoughts, and as he reached the foot of Schoolhouse Hill he caught sight of Hale's sleigh in the distance. He hurried forward to meet it, but as it drew near he saw that it was driven by the carpenter's youngest boy, and that the figure at his side, looking like a large upright cocoon in spectacles, was that of Mrs. Hale. Ethan signed to them to stop, and Mrs. Hale leaned forward, her pink wrinkles twinkling with benevolence. "Mr. Hale? Why, yes, you'll find him down home now. He ain't going to his work this forenoon. He woke up with a touch of lumbago, and I just made him put on one of old Dr. Kidder's plasters and set right up into the fire." Beaming maternally on Ethan, she bent over to add, "I only just heard from Mr. Hale about Zeena's going over to Bettsbridge to see that new doctor. I'm real sorry she's feeling so bad again. I hope he thinks he can do something for her. I don't know anybody round here's had more sickness than Zeena. I always tell Mr. Hale I don't know what she'd have done if she hadn't had you to look after her, and I used to say the same thing about your mother. You had an awful mean time, Ethan Frome." She gave him a last nod of sympathy while her son chirped to the horse, and Ethan, as she drove off, stood in the middle of the road and stared after the retreating sleigh. It was a long time since anyone had spoken to him as kindly as Mrs. Hale. Most people were either indifferent to his troubles, or disposed to think it natural that a young fellow of his age should have carried without repining the burden of 3 crippled lives. But Mrs. Hale had said, "You've had an awful mean time, Ethan Frome," and he felt less alone with his misery. If the Hales were sorry for him, they would surely respond to his appeal. He started down the road toward their house, but at the end of a few yards he pulled up sharply, the blood in his face. For the first time, in the light of the words he had just heard, he saw what he was about to do. He was planning to take advantage of the Hales' sympathy, to obtain money from them on false pretenses. That was a plain statement of the cloudy purpose which had driven him in headlong to Starkfield. With the sudden perception of the point to which his madness had carried him, the madness fell, and he saw his life before him as it was. He was a poor man, the husband of a sickly woman, whom his desertion would leave alone and destitute, and even if he had had the heart to desert her, he could have done so only by deceiving 2 kindly people who had pitied him. He turned and walked slowly back to the farm. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9. At the kitchen door Daniel Byrne sat in his sleigh behind a big-boned grey who pawed the snow and swung his long head restlessly from side to side. Ethan went into the kitchen and found his wife by the stove. Her head was wrapped in her shawl, and she was reading a book called Kidney Troubles and Their Cure, on which he had had to pay extra postage only a few days before. Zeena did not move or look up when he entered, and after a moment he asked, "Where's Mattie?" Without lifting her eyes from the page, she replied, "I presume she's getting down her trunk." The blood rushed to his face. Getting down her trunk? Alone? "Jotham Powell's down in the woodlot, and Dan'l Burns says he darsn't leave that horse," she returned. Her husband, without stopping to hear the end of the phrase, had left the kitchen and sprung up the stairs. The door of Mattie's room was shut, and he wavered a moment on the landing. "Matt," he said in a low voice. But there was no answer, and he put his hand on the doorknob. He had never been in her room except once, in the early summer, when he had gone there to plaster up a leak in the eaves. But he remembered exactly how everything had looked: the red and white quilt on her narrow bed, the pretty pincushion on the chest of drawers, and over it the enlarged photograph of her mother, in an oxidized frame, with a bunch of dried grasses at the back. Now these and all other tokens of her presence had vanished, and the room looked as bare and comfortless as when Zeena had showed her into it on the day of her arrival. In the middle of the floor stood her trunk, and on the trunk she sat in her Sunday dress, her back turned to the door and her face in her hands. She had not heard Ethan's call because she was sobbing, and she did not hear his step till he stood close behind her and laid his hands on her shoulders. "Matt, oh, don't! Oh, Matt!" She started up, lifting her wet face to his. "Ethan, I thought I wasn't ever going to see you again." He took her in his arms, pressing her close, and with a trembling hand smoothed away the hair from her forehead. "Not see me again? What do you mean?" She sobbed out, "Jotham said you told him we wasn't to wait dinner for you, and I thought—" "You thought I meant to cut it," he finished for her grimly. She clung to him without answering, and he laid his lips on her hair, which was soft yet springy, like certain mosses on warm slopes, and had the faint, woody fragrance of fresh sawdust in the sun. Through the door they heard Zeena's voice calling out from below, "Dan'l Burns says you better hurry up if you want him to take that trunk." They drew apart with stricken faces. Words of resistance rushed to Ethan's lips and died there. Mattie found her handkerchief and dried her eyes. Then, bending down, she took hold of a handle of the trunk. Ethan put her aside. "You let go, Matt," he ordered her. She answered, "It takes two to coax it round the corner." And submitting to this argument he grasped the other handle, and together they manoeuvred the heavy trunk out to the landing. "Now let go," he repeated. Then he shouldered the trunk and carried it down the stairs and across the passage to the kitchen. Zeena, who had gone back to her seat by the stove, did not lift her head from her book as he passed. Mattie followed him out of the door and helped him to lift the trunk into the back of the sleigh. When it was in place they stood side by side on the doorstep, watching Daniel Byrne plunge off behind his fidgety horse. It seemed to Ethan that his heart was bound with cords which an unseen hand was tightening with every tick of the clock. Twice he opened his lips to speak to Mattie, and found no breath. At length, as she turned to re-enter the house, he laid a detaining hand on her. "I'm going to drive you over, Matt," he whispered. She murmured back, "I think Zeena wants I should go with Jotham." "I'm going to drive you over," he repeated, and she went into the kitchen without answering. At dinner Ethan could not eat. If he lifted his eyes they rested on Zeena's pinched face, and the corners of her straight lips seemed to quiver away into a smile. She ate well, declaring that the mild weather made her feel better, and pressed a second helping of beans on Jotham Powell, whose wants she generally ignored. Mattie, when the meal was over, went about her usual task of clearing the table and washing up the dishes. Zeena, after feeding the cat, had returned to her rocking-chair by the stove, and Jotham Powell, who always lingered last, reluctantly pushed back his chair and moved toward the door. On the threshold he turned back to say to Ethan, "What time'll I come round for Mattie?" Ethan was standing near the window, mechanically filling his pipe while he watched Mattie move to and fro. He answered, "You needn't come round. I'm going to drive her over myself." He saw the rise of the colour in Mattie's averted cheek, and the quick lifting of Zeena's head. "I want you should stay here this afternoon, Ethan," his wife said. "Jotham can drive Mattie over." Mattie flung an imploring glance at him, but he repeated curtly, "I'm going to drive her over myself." Zeena continued in the same even tone, "I wanted you should stay and fix up that stove in Mattie's room afore the girl gets here. It ain't been drawing right for nigh on a month now." Ethan's voice rose indignantly. "If it was good enough for Mattie, I guess it's good enough for a hired girl." "That girl that's coming told me she was used to a house where they had a furnace," Zeena persisted with the same monotonous mildness. "She'd better ha' stayed there, then," he flung back at her. And turning to Mattie, he added in a hard voice, "You be ready by 3, Matt. I've got business at Corbury." Jotham Powell had started for the barn, and Ethan strode down after him, aflame with anger. The pulses in his temples throbbed and a fog was in his eyes. He went about his task without knowing what force directed him, or whose hands and feet were fulfilling his orders. It was not till he led out the sorrel and backed him between the shafts of the sleigh that he once more became conscious of what he was doing. As he passed the bridle over the horse's head and wound the trances around the shafts, he remembered the day when he had made the same preparations in order to drive over and meet his wife's cousin at the Flats. It was little more than a year ago, on just such a soft afternoon, with a feel of spring in the air. The sorrel, turning the same big ringed eye on him, nuzzled the palm of his hand in the same way, and one by one all the days between rose up and stood before him. He flung the bearskin into the sleigh, climbed to the seat, and drove up to the house. When he entered the kitchen it was empty, but Mattie's bag and shawl lay ready by the door. He went to the foot of the stairs and listened. No sound reached him from above, but presently he thought he heard someone moving about in his deserted study, and pushing open the door he saw Mattie, in her hat and jacket, standing with her back to him near the table. She started at his approach, and turning quickly said, "Is it time?" "What are you doing here, Matt?" he asked her. She looked at him timidly. "I was just taking a look round, that's all," she answered, with a wavering smile. They went back into the kitchen without speaking, and Ethan picked up her bag and shawl. "Where's Zeena?" he asked. "She went right upstairs after dinner. She said she had those shooting pains again, and didn't want to be disturbed." "Didn't she say good-bye to you?" "No, that was all she said." Ethan, looking slowly about the kitchen, said to himself with a shudder that in a few hours he would be returning to it alone. Then the sense of unreality overcame him once more, and he could not bring himself to believe that Mattie stood there for the last time before him. "Come on," he said almost gaily, opening the door and putting her bag into the sleigh. He sprang to his seat and bent over to tuck the rug about her as she slipped into the place at his side. "Now then, go along," he said, with a shake of the reins that sent the sorrel placidly jogging down the hill. "We got lots of time for a good ride, Matt," he cried, seeking her hand beneath the fur and pressing it in his. His face tingled and he felt dizzy, as if he had stopped in at the Starkfield saloon on a 0 day for a drink. At the gate, instead of making for Starkfield, he turned the sorrel to the right, up the Bettsbridge road. Mattie sat silent, giving no sign of surprise, but after a moment she said, "Are you going round by Shadow Pond?" He laughed and answered, "I knew you'd know." She drew closer under the bearskin, so that, looking sideways around his coat-sleeve, he could just catch the tip of her nose and a blown brown wave of hair. They drove slowly up the road between fields glistening under the pale sun, and then bent to the right down a lane edged with spruce and larch. Ahead of them, a long way off, a range of hills stained by mottlings of black forest flowed away in round white curves against the sky. The lane passed into a pine wood with boles reddening in the afternoon sun, and delicate blue shadows on the snow. As they entered it, the breeze fell, and a warm stillness seemed to drop from the branches with the dropping needles. Here the snow was so pure that the tiny tracks of wood animals had left on it intricate lace-like patterns, and the bluish cones caught in its surface stood out like ornaments of bronze. Ethan drove on in silence till they reached a part of the wood where the pines were more widely spaced. Then he drew up and helped Mattie to get out of the sleigh. They passed between the aromatic trunks, the snow breaking crisply under their feet, till they came to a small sheet of water with steep wooded sides. Across its frozen surface, from the farther bank, a single hill rising against the western sun threw the long conical shadow which gave the lake its name. It was a shy, secret spot, full of the same dumb melancholy that Ethan felt in his heart. He looked up and down the little pebbly beach, till his eye lit on a fallen tree-trunk half submerged in snow. "That's where we sat at the picnic," he reminded her. The entertainment of which he spoke was one of the few that they had taken part in together, a church picnic, which, on a long afternoon of the preceding summer, had filled the retired place with merrymaking. Mattie had begged him to go with her, but he had refused. Then, toward sunset, coming down from the mountain where he had been felling timber, he had been caught by some strayed revellers and drawn into the group by the lake, where Mattie, encircled by facetious youths, and bright as a blackberry under her spreading hat, was brewing coffee over a gypsy fire. He remembered the shyness he had felt at approaching her in his uncouth clothes, and then the lighting up of her face, and the way she had broken through the group to come to him with a cup in her hand. They had sat for a few minutes on the fallen log by the pond, and she had missed her gold locket, and set the young men searching for it, and it was Ethan who had spied it in the moss. That was all, but all their intercourse had been made up of just such inarticulate flashes, when they seemed to come suddenly upon happiness, as if they had surprised a butterfly in the winter woods. "It was right there I found your locket," he said, pushing his foot into a dense tuft of blueberry bushes. "I never saw anybody with such sharp eyes," she answered. She sat down on the tree trunk in the sun, and he sat down beside her. "You were as pretty as a picture in that pink hat," he said. She laughed with pleasure. "Oh, I guess it was the hat," she rejoined. They had never before avowed their inclination so openly, and Ethan, for a moment, had the illusion that he was a free man, wooing the girl he meant to marry. He looked at her hair and longed to touch it again, and to tell her that it smelt of the woods, but he had never learned to say such things. Suddenly she rose to her feet and said, "We mustn't stay here any longer." He continued to gaze at her vaguely, only half roused from his dream. "There's plenty of time," he answered. They stood looking at each other as if the eyes of each were straining to absorb and hold fast the other's image. There were things he had to say to her before they parted, but he could not say them in that place of summer memories, and he turned and followed her in silence to the sleigh. As they drove away the sun sank behind the hill, and the pine boles turned from red to grey. By a devious track between the fields they wound back to the Starkfield road. Under the open sky the light was still clear, with a reflection of cold red on the eastern hills. The clumps of trees in the snow seemed to draw together in ruffled lumps, like birds with their heads under their wings, and the sky, as it paled, rose higher, leaving the earth more alone. As they turned into the Starkfield road, Ethan said, "Matt, what do you mean to do?" She did not answer at once, but at length she said, "I'll try to get a place in a store." "You know you can't do it. The bad air and standing all day nearly killed you before." "I'm a lot stronger than I was before I came to Starkfield." "And now you're going to throw away all the good it's done you." There seemed to be no answer to this, and again they drove on for a while without speaking. With every yard of the way some spot where they had stood and laughed together or been silent clutched at Ethan and dragged him back. "Isn't there any of your father's folks could help you?" "There isn't any of 'em I'd ask." He lowered his voice to say, "You know there's nothing I wouldn't do for you if I could." "I know there isn't." "But I can't." She was silent, but he felt a slight tremor in the shoulder against his. "Oh, Matt," he broke out, "if I could 'a' gone with you now I'd 'a' done it." She turned to him, pulling a scrap of paper from her breast. "Ethan, I found this," she stammered. Even in the failing light he saw it was the letter to his wife that he had begun the night before and forgotten to destroy. Through his astonishment there ran a fierce thrill of joy. "Matt," he cried, "if I could 'a' done it, would you?" "Oh, Ethan, Ethan, what's the use?" With a sudden movement she tore the letter in shreds and sent them fluttering off into the snow. "Tell me, Matt, tell me," he adjured her. She was silent for a moment. Then she said, in such a low tone that he had to stoop his head to hear her, "I used to think of it sometimes, summer nights, when the moon was so bright I couldn't sleep." His heart reeled with the sweetness of it. "As long ago as that?" She answered as if the date had been long fixed for her. "The first time was at Shadow Pond." "Was that why you gave me my coffee before the others?" "I don't know. Did I? I was dreadfully put out when you wouldn't go to the picnic with me, and then, when I saw you coming down the road, I thought maybe you'd gone home that way a purpose, and that made me glad." They were silent again. They had reached the point where the road dipped to the hollow by Ethan's mill, and as they descended the darkness descended with them, dropping down like a black veil from the heavy hemlock boughs. "I'm tied hand and foot, Matt. There isn't a thing I can do," he began again. "You must write to me sometimes, Ethan." "Oh, what good'll writing do? I want to put out my hand and touch you. I want to do for you and care for you. I want to be there when you're sick and when you're lonesome." "You mustn't think but what I'll do all right." "You won't need me, you mean? I suppose you'll marry." "Oh, Ethan!" she cried. "I don't know how it is you make me feel, Matt. I'd almost rather have you dead than that." "Oh, I wish I was! I wish I was!" she sobbed. The sound of her weeping shook him out of his dark anger, and he felt ashamed. "Don't let's talk that way," he whispered. "Why shouldn't we, when it's true? I've been wishing it every minute of the day." "Matt, you be quiet. Don't you say it." "There's never anybody been good to me but you." "Don't say that, either, when I can't lift a hand for you." "Yes, but it's true just the same." They had reached the top of Schoolhouse Hill, and Starkfield lay below them in the twilight. A cutter, mounting the road from the village, passed them by in a joyous flutter of bells, and they straightened themselves and looked ahead with rigid faces. Along the main street lights had begun to shine from the house-fronts, and stray figures were turning in here and there at the gates. Ethan, with a touch of his whip, roused the sorrel to a languid trot. As they drew near the end of the village, the cries of children reached them, and they saw a knot of boys, with sleds behind them, scattering across the open space before the church. "I guess this'll be their last coast for a day or two," Ethan said, looking up at the mild sky. Mattie was silent, and he added, "We were to have gone down last night." Still she did not speak, and, prompted by an obscure desire to help himself and her through their miserable last hour, he went on discursively, "Ain't it funny we haven't been down together but just that once last winter?" She answered, "It wasn't often I got down to the village." "That's so," he said. They had reached the crest of the Corbury road, and between the indistinct white glimmer of the church and the black curtain of the Varnum spruces the slope stretched away below them without a sled on its length. Some erratic impulse prompted Ethan to say, "How'd you like me to take you down now?" She forced a laugh. "Why, there isn't time." "There's all the time we want. Come along." His one desire now was to postpone the moment of turning the sorrel toward the flats. "But the girl," she faltered. "The girl'll be waiting at the station." "Well, let her wait. You'd have to if she didn't. Come." The note of authority in his voice seemed to subdue her, and when he had jumped from the sleigh she let him help her out, saying only with a vague feint of reluctance, "But there isn't a sled round anywheres." "Yes, there is. Right over there under the spruces." He threw the bearskin over the sorrel, who stood passively by the roadside, hanging a meditative head. Then he caught Mattie's hand and drew her after him toward the sled. She seated herself obediently, and he took his place behind her, so close that her hair brushed his face. "All right, Matt," he called out, as if the width of the road had been between them. She turned her head to say, "It's dreadfully dark. Are you sure you can see?" He laughed contemptuously. "I could go down this coast with my eyes tied." And she laughed with him, as if she liked his audacity. Nevertheless he sat still a moment, straining his eyes down the long hill, for it was the most confusing hour of the evening, the hour when the last clearness from the upper sky is merged with the rising night in a blur that disguises landmarks and falsifies distances. "Now!" he cried. The sled started with a bound, and they flew on through the dusk, gathering smoothness and speed as they went, with the hollow night opening out below them and the air singing by like an organ. Mattie sat perfectly still, but as they reached the bend at the foot of the hill, where the big elm thrust out a deadly elbow, he fancied that she shrank a little closer. "Don't be scared, Matt!" he cried exultantly, as they spun safely past it and flew down the second slope, and when they reached the level ground beyond and the speed of the sled began to slacken, he heard her give a little laugh of glee. They sprang off and started to walk back up the hill. Ethan dragged the sled with one hand and passed the other through Mattie's arm. "Were you scared I'd run you into the elm?" he asked with a boyish laugh. "I told you I was never scared with you," she answered. The strange exaltation of his mood had brought on one of his rare fits of boastfulness. "It is a tricky place, though. The least swerve and we'd never come up again. But I can measure distances to a hair's breadth. Always could." She murmured, "I always say you've got the surest eye." Deep silence had fallen with the starless dusk, and they leaned on each other without speaking. But at every step of their climb, Ethan said to himself, "It's the last time we'll ever walk together." They mounted slowly to the top of the hill. When they were abreast of the church he stooped his head to her to ask, "Are you tired?" And she answered, breathing quickly, "It was splendid." With a pressure of his arm he guided her toward the Norway spruces. "I guess this sled must be Ned Hale's. Anyhow, I'll leave it where I found it." He drew the sled up to the Varnum gate and rested it against the fence. As he raised himself he suddenly felt Mattie close to him among the shadows. "Is this where Ned and Ruth kissed each other?" she whispered breathlessly, and flung her arms about him. Her lips, groping for his, swept over his face, and he held her fast in a rapture of surprise. "Good-bye, good-bye," she stammered, and kissed him again. "Oh, Matt, I can't let you go!" broke from him in the same old cry. She freed herself from his hold, and he heard her sobbing. "Oh, I can't go either," she wailed. "Matt, what'll we do? What'll we do?" They clung to each other's hands like children, and her body shook with desperate sobs. Through the stillness they heard the church clock striking 5. "Oh, Ethan, it's time!" she cried. He drew her back to him. "Time for what? You don't suppose I'm going to leave you now?" "If I missed my train, where'd I go?" "Where are you going if you catch it?" She stood silent, her hands lying cold and relaxed in his. "What's the good of either of us going anywheres without the other one now?" he said. She remained motionless, as if she had not heard him. Then she snatched her hands from his, threw her arms about his neck, and pressed a sudden drenched cheek against his face. "Ethan, Ethan, I want you to take me down again." "Down where?" "The coast, right off," she panted, "so it will never come up any more." "Matt, what on earth do you mean?" She put her lips close against his ear to say, "Right into the big elm. You said you could, so we'd never have to leave each other any more." "Why, what are you talking of? You're crazy." "I'm not crazy, but I will be if I leave you." "Oh, Matt, Matt," he groaned. She tightened her fierce hold about his neck. Her face lay close to his face. "Ethan, where'll I go if I leave you? I don't know how to get along alone. You said so yourself just now. Nobody but you was ever good to me. And there'll be that strange girl in the house, and she'll sleep in my bed, where I used to lay nights and listen to hear you come up the stairs." The words were like fragments torn from his heart. With them came the hated vision of the house he was going back to, of the stairs he would have to go up every night, of the woman who would wait for him there. And the sweetness of Mattie's avowal, the wild wonder of knowing at last that all that had happened to him had happened to her too, made the other vision more abhorrent, the other life more intolerable to return to. Her pleadings still came to him between short sobs, but he no longer heard what she was saying. Her hat had slipped back, and he was stroking her hair. He wanted to get the feeling of it into his hand, so that it would sleep there like a seed in winter. Once he found her mouth again, and they seemed to be by the pond together in the burning August sun. But his cheek touched hers, and it was cold and full of weeping, and he saw the road to the flats under the night, and heard the whistle of the train up the line. The spruces swathed them in blackness and silence. They might have been in their coffins underground. He said to himself, "Perhaps it'll feel like this. And then again, after this, I shan't feel anything." Suddenly he heard the old sorrel whinny across the road, and thought, "He's wondering why he doesn't get his supper." "Come," Mattie whispered, tugging at his hand. Her sombre violence constrained him. She seemed the embodied instrument of fate. He pulled the sled out, blinking like a night-bird as he passed from the shade of the spruces into the transparent dusk of the open. The slope below them was deserted. All Starkfield was at supper, and not a figure crossed the open space before the church. The sky, swollen with the clouds that announce a thaw, hung as low as before a summer storm. He strained his eyes through the dimness, and they seemed less keen, less capable than usual. He took his seat on the sled, and Mattie instantly placed herself in front of him. Her hat had fallen into the snow, and his lips were in her hair. He stretched out his legs, drove his heels into the road to keep the sled from slipping forward, and bent her head back between his hands. Then suddenly he sprang up again. "Get up," he ordered her. It was the tone she always heeded, but she cowered down in her seat, repeating vehemently, "No, no, no!" "Get up!" "Why?" "I want to sit in front." "No, no! How can you steer in front?" "I don't have to. We'll follow the track." They spoke in smothered whispers, as though the night were listening. "Get up! Get up!" he urged her, but she kept on repeating, "Why do you want to sit in front?" Because I want to feel you holding me," he stammered, and dragged her to her feet. The answer seemed to satisfy her, or else she yielded to the power of his voice. He bent down, feeling in the obscurity for the glassy slide worn by preceding coasters, and placed the runners carefully between its edges. She waited while he seated himself with crossed legs in the front of the sled. Then she crouched quickly down at his back, and clasped her arms about him. Her breath in his neck set him shuddering again, and he almost sprang from his seat. But in a flash he remembered the alternative. She was right. This was better than parting. He leaned back, and drew her mouth to his. Just as they started he heard the sorrel's whinny again, and the familiar wistful call, and all the confused images it brought with it went with him down the first reach of the road. Half-way down there was a sudden drop, then a rise, and after that another long delirious descent. As they took wing for this it seemed to him that they were flying indeed, flying far up into the cloudy night, with Starkfield immeasurably below them, falling away like a speck in space. Then the big elm shot up ahead, lying in wait for them at the bend of the road, and he said between his teeth, "We can fetch it. I know we can fetch it." As they flew toward the tree Mattie pressed her arms tighter, and her blood seemed to be in his veins. Once or twice the sled swerved a little under them. He slanted his body to keep it headed for the elm, repeating to himself again and again, "I know we can fetch it." And little phrases she had spoken ran through his head and danced before him on the air. The big tree loomed bigger and closer, and as they bore down on it he thought, "It's waiting for us. It seems to know." But suddenly his wife's face, with twisted, monstrous lineaments, thrust itself between him and his goal, and he made an instinctive movement to brush it aside. The sled swerved in response, but he righted it again, kept it straight, and drove down on the black projecting mass. There was a last instant when the air shot past him like millions of fiery wires, and then the elm. The sky was still thick, but looking straight up he saw a single star, and tried vaguely to reckon whether it were Sirius, or... The effort tired him too much, and he closed his heavy lids and thought that he would sleep. The stillness was so profound that he heard a little animal twittering somewhere near by under the snow. It made a small, frightened cheep, like a field mouse, and he wondered languidly if it were hurt. Then he understood that it must be in pain, pain so excruciating that he seemed, mysteriously, to feel it shooting through his own body. He tried in vain to roll over in the direction of the sound, and stretched his left arm out across the snow. And now it was as though he felt rather than heard the twittering. It seemed to be under his palm, which rested on something soft and springy. The thought of the animal's suffering was intolerable to him, and he struggled to raise himself, and could not, because a rock or some huge mass seemed to be lying on him. But he continued to finger about cautiously with his left hand, thinking he might get hold of the little creature and help it, and all at once he knew that the soft thing he had touched was Mattie's hair, and that his hand was on her face. He dragged himself to his knees, the monstrous load on him moving with him as he moved, and his hand went over and over her face, and he felt that the twittering came from her lips. He got his face down close to hers, with his ear to her mouth, and in the darkness he saw her eyes open, and heard her say his name. "Oh, Matt, I thought we'd fetched it," he moaned. And far off, up the hill, he heard the sorrel whinny, and thought, "I ought to be getting him his feed." The querulous drones ceased as I entered Frome's kitchen, and of the two women sitting there I could not tell which had been the speaker. One of them, on my appearing, raised her tall bony figure from her seat, not as if to welcome me, for she threw me no more than a brief glance of surprise, but simply to set about preparing the meal which Frome's absence had delayed. A slatternly calico wrapper hung from her shoulders, and the wisps of her thin grey hair were drawn away from a high forehead, and fastened at the back by a broken comb. She had pale, opaque eyes which revealed nothing and reflected nothing, and her narrow lips were of the same sallow colour as her face. The other woman was much smaller and slighter. She sat huddled in an armchair near the stove, and when I came in she turned her head quickly toward me, without the least corresponding movement of her body. Her hair was as grey as her companion's, her face as bloodless and shrivelled, but amber-tinted, with swarthy shadows sharpening the nose and hollowing the temples. Under her shapeless dress her body kept its limp immobility, and her dark eyes had the bright witch-like stare that disease of the spine sometimes gives. Even for that part of the country the kitchen was a poor-looking place. With the exception of the dark-eyed woman's chair, which looked like a soiled relic of luxury bought at a country auction, the furniture was of the roughest kind. 3 coarse china plates and a broken-nosed milk-jug had been set on a greasy table scored with knife-cuts, and a couple of straw-bottomed chairs and a kitchen dresser of unpainted pine stood meagrely against the plaster walls. "My, it's cold here. The fire must be most out," Frome said, glancing about him apologetically as he followed me in. The tall woman, who had moved away from us toward the dresser, took no notice, but the other, from her cushioned niche, answered complainingly in a high, thin voice. "It's only just been made up this very minute. Zena fell asleep and slept ever so long, and I thought I'd be frozen stiff before I could wake her up and get her to tend to it." I knew then that it was she who had been speaking when we entered. Her companion, who was just coming back to the table with the remains of a cold mince pie in a battered pie dish, set down her unappetizing burden without appearing to hear the accusation brought against her. Frome stood hesitatingly before her as she advanced. Then he looked at me and said, "This is my wife, Miss Frome." After another interval he added, turning toward the figure in the armchair, "And this is Miss Mattie Silver." Mrs. Hale, tender soul, had pictured me as lost in the flats and buried under a snowdrift, and so lively was her satisfaction on seeing me safely restored to her the next morning that I felt my peril had caused me to advance several degrees in her favour. Great was her amazement, and that of old Mrs. Varnum, on learning that Ethan Frome's old horse had carried me to and from Corbury Junction through the worst blizzard of the winter. Greater still their surprise when they heard that his master had taken me in for the night. Beneath their wondering exclamations I felt a secret curiosity to know what impressions I had received from my night in the Frome household, and divined that the best way of breaking down their reserve was to let them try to penetrate mine. I therefore confined myself to saying, in a matter-of-fact tone, that I had been received with great kindness, and that Frome had made a bed for me in a room on the ground floor, which seemed in happier days to have been fitted up as a kind of writing-room or study. "Well," Mrs. Hale mused, "in such a storm I suppose he felt he couldn't do less than take you in, but I guess it went hard with Ethan. I don't believe but what you're the only stranger has set foot in that house for over 20 years. He's that proud he don't even like his old friends to go there, and I don't know as any do, any more, except myself and the doctor." "You still go there, Mrs. Hale?" I ventured. "I used to go a good deal after the accident, when I was first married, but after a while I got to think it made him feel worse to see us, and then one thing and another came, and my own troubles. But I generally make out to drive over there round about New Year's, and once in the summer. Only I try always to pick a day when Ethan's off somewheres. It's bad enough to see the 2 women sitting there, but his face, when he looks round that bare place, just kills me. You see, I can look back and call it up in his mother's day, before their troubles." Old Mrs. Varnum by this time had gone up to bed, and her daughter and I were sitting alone after supper in the austere seclusion of the horsehair parlour. Mrs. Hale glanced at me tentatively, as though trying to see how much footing my conjectures gave her, and I guessed that if she had kept silence till now it was because she had been waiting, through all the years, for someone who should see what she alone had seen. I waited to let her trust in me gather strength before I said, "Yes, it's pretty bad, seeing all 3 of them there together." She drew her mild brows into a frown of pain. "It was just awful from the beginning. I was here in the house when they were carried up. They laid Mattie Silver in the room you're in. She and I were great friends, and she was to have been my bridesmaid in the spring. When she came to I went up to her and stayed all night. They gave her things to quiet her, and she didn't know much till toward morning, and then all of a sudden she woke up just like herself, and looked straight at me out of her big eyes and said, "Oh, I don't know why I'm telling you all this." Mrs. Hale broke off, crying. She took off her spectacles, wiped the moisture from them, and put them on again with an unsteady hand. "It got about the next day," she went on, "that Zeena Frome had sent Matty off in a hurry because she had a hired girl coming, and the folks here could never rightly tell what she and Ethan were doing that night coasting, when they'd ought to have been on their way to the flats to catch the train. I never knew myself what Zeena thought. I don't to this day. Nobody knows Zeena's thoughts. Anyhow, when she heard of the accident she came right in and stayed with Ethan over to the minister's, where they'd carried him. And as soon as the doctor said that Matty could be moved, Zeena sent for her and took her back to the farm." "And there she's been ever since." Mrs. Hale answered simply, "There was nowhere else for her to go," and my heart tightened at the thought of the hard compulsions of the poor. "Yes, there she's been," Mrs. Hale continued, "and Zeena's done for her, and done for Ethan as good as she could. It was a miracle, considering how sick she was. But she seemed to be raised right up just when the call came to her. Not as she's ever given up doctoring, and she's had sick spells right along, but she's had the strength given to her to care for those two for over 20 years, and before the accident came she thought she couldn't even care for herself." Mrs. Hale paused a moment, and I remained silent, plunged in the vision of what her words evoked. "It's horrible for them all," I murmured. "Yes, it's pretty bad. And they ain't any of 'em easy people either. Matty was, before the accident. I never knew a sweeter nature. But she's suffered too much. That's what I always say when folks tell me how she's soured. And Zeena, she was always cranky. Not but what she bears with Matty wonderful, I've seen that myself. But sometimes the two of them get going at each other, and then Ethan's face'd break your heart. When I see that, I think it's him that suffers most. Anyhow, it ain't Zeena because she ain't got the time. It's a pity, though," Mrs. Hale ended, sighing, "that they're all shut up there in that one kitchen. In the summer-time, on pleasant days, they move Matty into the parlour, or out in the dooryard, and that makes it easier. But winters there's the fires to be thought of, and there ain't a dime to spare up at the Fromes." Mrs. Hale drew a deep breath, as though her memory were eased of its long burden, and she had no more to say, but suddenly an impulse of complete avowal seized her. She took off her spectacles again, leaned toward me across the beadwork table-cover, and went on with lowered voice. "There was one day, about a week after the accident, when they all thought Matty couldn't live. Well, I say it's a pity she did. I said it right out to our minister once, and he was shocked at me. Only he wasn't with me that morning when she first came to. And I say, if she'd had died, Ethan might 'a' lived. And the way they are now, I don't see's there's much difference between the Fromes up at the farm and the Fromes down in the graveyard, 'cept that down there they're all quiet, and the women have got to hold their tongues." End of Ethan Frome, by Edith Wharton.